Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this seminar on graphite processing. We are just opening the floor for all participants to attend. So we'll wait a couple of more seconds before we really start. Looking forward to having you all here at this meeting, and it promises to be a nice debate. There's quite of some expertise in the room, so to say. So I guess we will bring this topic a bit further than at the start of this meeting. So hopefully you'll all enjoy it. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Michel Rademacher. I'm the Deputy Director of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and I'm one of the co-founders. And I'll be your moderator today. So to introduce a bit what it's all about, I start with a bit broader concept of that. Under the Paris Agreement, there were made quite some commitments to try to change the position of the EU and basically the broader world, of course, in terms of climate change. The European Green Deal came off, and COP26 even sharpened the goals set for both countries and companies all over the world to adapt to climate change goals and reach carbon neutrality as soon as possible. As a consequence of this, the demand for graphite, and that's the topic of today, is projected to grow almost 350% towards 2030. And the bulk of this will be used for two industries, specifically battery production and the production of electrodes for electric arc furnaces. So these are two crucial applications that in areas with high potential for decarbonization contributions to indeed help mitigate our climate problems, actually. So graphite is in a pole position to contribute, being a crucial material in the clean tech solutions that are basically possible nowadays, as far as we understand, for lithium-ion batteries and these furnaces. So the questions that we'd like to address today is basically to start with, what is graphite and what is graphite processing? So what is so critical about the material? How has it happened that it is so critical? What to do about it? And how to do about it? So these 5 questions are being addressed by the various analysts, experts that we have today. And I will introduce them one by one by the time that we get them on the floor, so to say. But as a starter, I would like to introduce to you Nico Chovas. I'm never sure, Nico, where I pronounce it correctly. You're the CEO of Urbix, and you're the genius behind the new concept of graphite processing. And you're the one in the room, so to say, that is perfectly positioned to explain what graphite is and what your processing solution that you have is all about. So I'd like to give you the floor and explain us all a bit further on what this all is. Please, the floor is yours, Nico.
Thank you, Michel. Thank you for the platform. I want to thank also the HCSS for developing this report. I think there's very much a necessity to be able to shed light into the less known, in my opinion, of critical minerals. I also want to thank the colleagues and fellow panelists, some of which I've spoken to before, some of which I have not. I think most of you guys I've spoken to. And I just, full disclosure, I am not a genius. The people that work at Urbix are, and they're the ones that were able to develop this technology. So let's talk a little bit about graphite. The report that was published does a fantastic job in explaining in more technical detail what it is. But to the less technical people like me, sometimes it's good to actually be able to put it in perspective in a primary grade school type of explanation. So If you look online, Google, it'll tell you that graphite is an allotrope of carbon. So what the hell does an allotrope mean? Well, in essence is for every chemical element, allotrope simply means that there's different forms of that specific element in existence. So let's utilize, as in Dutch, you will say aardeleppen, right? Potatoes. So let's think of aardeplen. So potatoes are, let's picture graphite in this case, a carbon. So you can get mashed potatoes, you can get crisps, and you can get French fries. They're all potatoes. That is in essence what an allotrope is, right? So steel potatoes just in existence in different shapes and forms. So graphite throughout history has been utilized for many applications for reinforcing metals, as lubricants, as brakes, et cetera, et cetera. But it also has a very specific morphological structure that allows for a reversible type of flow of lithium ions in and out of the element itself. What does that mean? Well, graphite, not only because of the cost, but of its capacity to be able to intercalate lithium ions, plays a very, very crucial role in storing energy. So as we approach this energy transition and the aggressive goals that our politicians and OEMs have set out to do to save the world, graphite now is center stage in many of these topics of conversation. Why? Because graphite right now, as it stands, is the only commercially available or viable solution that will give us the capacity to achieve many of these energy transition goals as the agent of storing energy inside the batteries, right? Not only in batteries, but also graphite will play a critical role in nuclear energy, a much needed type of energy to be able to achieve our CO2 emission goals over the next 10 years. So graphite processing, what does that mean? That's one of the questions that you mentioned at the beginning of the introduction. Graphite processing basically is the ability for graphite to be shaped into an adequate form so that it can be utilized in different applications. Specifically relating to this lithium ion one, what we tend to do is we utilize graphite and we elevate the purity, make it into little tiny balls, and those tiny balls end up on the negative side of a battery. And that's where the lithium ions, when you actually charge your battery, park themselves in the negative side of the battery. And that's how you store energy. And when you utilize that product, the lithium ions flow back into the positive side. That's a very high level type of explanation, but that's how it works. There's two different types of graphite currently being utilized in the industry for anode purposes, meaning synthetic and also natural. So natural is extracted from the ground. You elevate the purity, you make the little balls, and then you put them inside the negative side of a battery. And then there's your synthetic graphite, which is typically made out of needle coke or petroleum coke that gets thermally treated at 3,000 degrees Celsius to make that same graphite, like it's called graphitizing, to make that graphite synthetically. However, there's some sort of controversy around it because it doesn't really align with what this energy transition is all about, right? We're trying to mitigate the utilization of oil as one component of this energy transition, and we're utilizing it to make synthetic graphite. So it's up to us to decide globally how and when we actually begin adhering or actually aligning to the paths of the essence of this transition. So we also need to understand that in order to achieve these goals, we need to utilize these types of products. But in the long run, we need to have a mid and long-term vision to start mitigating the use of the same. So I don't know if you have any other specific questions in regards to graphite, but I just give you a full overview, a very high-level overview of what it is.
Thank you, Nico. But maybe you can explain a little bit what the difference is with the current processes of the process that Urbix at this point utilize.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. So there's two predominant ways of actually processing graphite or to make it usable in lithium-ion batteries. One is high temperature treatment, that utilizes a lot of electricity and a lot of inert gas to be able to elevate the temperature of an oven to 3,000 degrees Celsius to be able to purify graphite. That consumes a lot of electricity, and it takes a long time. Sometimes it takes a period of 8 days of treating this graphite in an oven to be able to achieve these purities. The other method is hydrofluoric acid washing, which it's also extremely caustic and toxic for the individuals working with it, but also for the environment if not contained appropriately. Given the fact that predominantly these methods are utilized in China, there is a difficulty in tracking and tracing the manner in which these methods are being controlled or contained. So when we started Urbix, we began with that notion of how do we address this issue, because in essence, this actually does not, it removes the purity of what this energy transition is all about. I keep on saying that all over and over again. So our vision was to develop a processing method that was true to the actual essence of this, and was not, and say, hypocritical, right? So we developed a mechanism of actually purifying graphite without using hydrofluoric acid or high temperature ovens, thus reducing the electrical requirements, but also the real estate required and the containment mechanisms required for hydrofluoric acid to be utilized in a safe manner. So what we develop now, and we are at a pre-commercial scale in Phoenix, Arizona. You can come visit anytime you wish. Was a way of purifying graphite that does not utilize hydrofluoric acid or high temp ovens. We're in a light industrial zone. Our overall footprint per metric ton is extremely low, and our CO2 emissions, kilogram emissions per every kilogram of graphite is about 40% of those being currently published by the Korean anode makers utilizing the conventional Chinese method. So we're modular approach, meaning that we can build these things like McDonald's, you know. I'm not saying we're quality of McDonald's, but we can expand as fast as them. And that's the whole idea of the modular aspect, right? Especially as we expand into Europe, which is a plan that we have. You know, you guys don't have as much real estate as the United States does. So we need to be very cautious and also very strategic as to how we expand in the European Union. So we have that in mind, right? We're currently in a light industrial zone that gives you an idea of how clean we are. So I think it's a very synergistic fit for the very aggressive goals that the European Union has in terms of achieving the goals of this energy transition. Great.
Yeah, nice also to hear that it is so efficient, besides that it's cleaner. Maybe a last short question, Nico, is it any ideas already how it will compete in terms of cost with the traditional processes? Is it cheaper, or is it maybe more expensive but faster? So any clue already, or is it too early to tell?
No, we do have a clue. One of the things I forgot to mention, thank you for bringing it up. We do achieve 70+% yields versus the current standard method of 30% yields, which allows us to be extremely competitive in terms of pricing. Our strategy is not to be cheaper. Our strategy is to be the fair price, you know, matching the price of the times. Again, there's only one way that prices are going to go, and that's up. We are going to be pricing at index pricing or whatever you can get at, but also offering the intangibles of a lower CO2 emissions and of onshoring this production capacity and not being Chinese equipment dependent, which is another key vulnerability that people fail to address. It's not just the processing bottlenecks, but also everybody that wants to do this outside of China, they need to actually get this equipment from China, right? Because they're using their standard methodology. So our strategy is charge the same price, maybe a premium perhaps, if possible, but also with the ability of actually making this, our cost is cheaper than the Chinese, of course. We're about 40% of the Chinese cost.
Right. Well, this all sounds really promising, and so in terms of price, but also in terms of industrial scaling, that you foresee is possible as well.
Yeah. Can I also bring another point? Sorry for interrupting. This is very important. A lot of the companies out there that are trying to be anode producers outside of China sometimes mention, they approach this as if it was a race between all the anode makers. The reality is this, Michelle, that if we all come online, all of the anode makers come online by 2025, the rest of the world will still need to get about 50% of their graphite processed from China. So the market will be massive. This is just based on the projections. So let's just keep that mentality in mind. This is almost let's get together, create almost a collaborative type of approach in terms of non-Chinese, or let's just call it ourselves like non-China anode processors, so that we can all be online to be able to address this transition as best as possible.
Okay, so well, thank you very much, Nico, for taking us by hand a bit on what it all is about, and also your business perspective in that sense. Quite interesting. And we'll, I think, hear a little bit more about this also from Amrish. Amrish is strategic.
Okay, I think we might have lost Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
There, Amrish, I guess you're going to be introduced. Do you want to?
Let me just check with Patrick. I think Michelle will come back now. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thrown out. Yeah, so we are at HCSS. We're also quite lucky that he is a subject matter expert at ours with this specialization. So I'd like you, Amrish, to give you the floor to explain a bit further what you as the main author of the report would like to share with us, please. So the floor is yours, Amrish.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I think, first of all, thank you. I think this is a good initiative by HCSS with the support of Urbix to actually organize this roundtable and get some more attention for a critical mineral that is not considered really sexy, but is super, super important. So I'm very happy that we spent some time on this. So, why is it critical? I think that's one of the questions you raised, Michelle. If you look at the applications where human civilization uses graphite, it's really, really diverse. So it ranges from graphite into lubricants, in steel making processes, energy storage, just as Nico said, and also for heavy industries. Now, the projection for the next 5 to 10 years is that two sectors in particular will drive this demand for graphite. The first one is energy storage through lithium-ion batteries, which Nico touched upon. It is expected or projected that demand will contribute to 25% of total demand. And then the other big chunk of demand will come from what we called electrodes. And electrodes are basically elements that can conduct heat into a sort of a pot where you can put in scrap metal, and then it melts the metal, the scrap, and you can make steel out of it. This last one, the electrodes are significant because, as you mentioned in the introduction, the Paris Climate Agreement basically has committed 190 countries to reduce their carbon footprint, and that also applies to steel making. So the steel industry is looking very heavily for alternative ways to produce steel. And rather than using gas or using coal, the latest techniques are to look at steel making by using electrodes, which conduct heat, but the electrodes are built up or made of graphite, and in particular synthetic graphite. So those two elements are very important in the energy transition, which is why graphite is already critical, but will become even more critical as these two industries, i.e. transport and heavy industry, try to greenify their business.
Thank you. The future need will make it critical. The other part is, of course, that China has at this point a dominant position in it, in this graphite processing, as Nico already alluded to as well. But could you maybe explain a little bit more how this has happened? Why is China so dominant at this point?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it basically applies to many other critical minerals, not only graphite, but you know, let's say from the 70s onwards, the West has been on a journey to deindustrialize. And if you look at the focus in economic activities in the West, it has moved from heavy industries to more service-related economic activities. And that process of deindustrialization meant that the West became more dependent for its industrial goods from other countries, and especially countries with low cost of labor and regulations which have been and still are a little bit less strict than we have in Europe, for instance. China is one of those countries, especially after the visit of Richard Nixon in 1974 to China. The country really opened up and the West started to invest heavily in China. That process of investing heavily in China meant also that we in the West basically took a very conscious decision to outsource processes and manufacturing to a country like China. Just, you know, as an example, the last time that a European company built a processing facility for manganese, another critical mineral, is 1974 by French company Eramet. And it ties back into what Nico just mentioned. If it's that long ago, almost 50 years ago, that you actually have produced your own facility, then you not only outsource the whole manufacturing, you also outsource the knowledge and the whole manufacturing and equipment making to other countries, which is why China is today where it is today, in a very dominant position, where it not only dominates the production of graphite and other minerals, but also the whole process behind it and the downstream process as well. And yeah, it's really the result of a choice that we have made in the West to deindustrialize.
Yeah, okay, clear. And so I hear you also saying between the lines, we should rethink our strategic positions here and reshore or rebuild our knowledge and infrastructure altogether, as what in the EU now is called strategic autonomy, to repair that a bit maybe. Well, that's my personal assessment. These kind of new technologies will help, and I think that also the current policy landscape is more ready to think in those terms nowadays than it used to be, actually. So thank you so much, Amrish, for this explanation. I'd like to go on and introduce you, Matt Fernley. He's the Managing Director of Battery Materials Review. Matt is the Managing Editor and has spent over 15 or 18 years as an equity analyst following mining, chemicals, and industrial sectors. So I think, Matt, you're actually very well positioned to take us along and to give your appreciation of the situation, but also the chances that this new technology might have in the future. So, and how do we make this work? So my two questions is, from your perspective, what to do and how to do it. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Michelle, and thanks to HCSS for putting this on as well. So I think that the big issue, what's become clear from the previous two presentations, is that we as Europeans, we as North Americans, we as ex-Chinese need to start investing in production capacity for all of these battery raw materials. And we need to start doing this yesterday. You know, a number of us in this industry have been flagging for 4 or 5 years the need to invest in raw materials upstream, midstream, and downstream very, very rapidly. And I think the situation in the last couple of years with regards to COVID and its impact on supply chains, and obviously more recently with regards to the Ukraine and its impact on supply chains, has just emphasized that it is very, very important that we move rapidly to deglobalize away from centers of production that might be on the other side of the world, and bring those centers of production much more closer to our demand markets. And it is now absolutely vital that we focus on that. How do we focus on that? Well, we've got to raise money. We've got to raise money in Europe, in North America, to build our own supply chains. And I think the struggle, particularly in the graphite market, is because of its opacity, it's very much struggled to attract investors. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, quite sexy markets, really easy to attract capital. Graphite is perceived more as an industrial mineral, and because there's lots of different end uses, even within the upstream, excluding the battery area, it has struggled with understanding. And I think, you know, one of the issues that we are dealing with on the capital market side is that there is a lack of understanding of graphite as an industry amongst investors, and more importantly, how to benchmark individual graphite projects. And you know, this is something that Battery Materials Review, that other analysts in the industry are trying to raise awareness of graphite and trying to raise understanding of graphite. You know, as we heard from Nico, it's a very complex market. You know, if we set aside the synthetic graphite stream for a second, you've got to dig it out of the ground, you've got to concentrate it, and then you've got to send it off for further processing. But what a lot of people don't understand is that when you're going all the way to battery graphite, it's a very, very pure product, very, very high specification product. Not all graphite deposits around the world are suitable for production of battery anode graphite. They have to have very specific physical properties, they have to have very specific chemical properties, and they have to have a very sort of specific purity. So it really is very, very difficult to find suitable deposits and then to go through the process of upgrading them. As Nico said, you know, there are a number of companies trying to go from upstream to midstream in the market at the moment. And as Nico said, which is very, very important, they're not competing against one another. We're going to need all of those companies to be successful. And in fact, we need more than those companies to be successful if we're to successfully construct a full graphite supply silo for the battery industry in North America and in Europe. And, you know, this is one of the big issues that we're dealing with from the point of view of institutional investors in equity markets. it's very difficult to invest in graphite. There is one graphite developer with a market capitalization of $2 billion. There's one producer with a market capitalization of $1 billion. And then there's 4 or 5 developers with market capitalizations of less than or around about $500 million. It's very, very difficult for institutional investors to apply capital to companies that are of that size, that are sub $1 billion of market capitalization. And because there's a lack of understanding of the industry among institutional investors, we're just not raising enough capital. So the capital then has to start to come from governments. It has to start to come from debt financing, and we need support from outside the equity markets. Just to give you an idea, the whole industry, the whole of the graphite industry globally, managed to raise $500 million in 2021. That's nowhere near what we need to be raising. We need to be raising $1 to $2 billion a year if we're going to fill in the supply chain. We're miles off. So, you know, the graphite industry as a whole, in fact, the battery materials industry as a whole, is crying out for support from government. We're seeing government support in battery materials going into the downstream. You know, we're seeing a lot of support, industry support going into recycling, really sexy, you know, carbon neutral areas. We're not seeing enough support from governments going into the upstream. And I'm particularly talking about areas like mining and upstream processing. We need support in terms of financial support. We need support in terms of planning support, easing the planning chain to get these projects underway. We're just not seeing it at the moment. So it's very, very important that governments come in and support this at a strategic level, both locally and nationally.
Thank you, Matt. Interesting. You say it's not sexy. Well, if you tell me I'm in a market with a projected growth of 350% and I'm in EVs, what's not sexy about that? So,
compared to other battery materials, it's not sexy. Yeah, I personally think it's very sexy, but there you go.
Yeah, it's also a matter of bringing it across that it is an important sector, and I hope that indeed the report that we're talking about today is also helping a bit on that. And of course, we will also make a synopsis of this video to also help it get across a bit further. So you said, well, there's a common, say, a yearly based 500 million investment, and we need at least 2 billion a year. But if I would look at the, well, Volkswagen and others, BMWs, they're all planning to have these cars. Should they be investing in this sector, or is that not the suitable party to do that?
Well, in my view, and in the view of lots of us who specialize in the raw material space, definitely they should be. I mean, just to give you some numbers, something like $170 billion has been raised or allocated to the electric vehicle side of the industry in the last 3 years, $80 billion to the battery side of the industry. During that time, we've only raised $20 billion for the whole of the raw material part of the industry. So, you know, we really are struggling with a lack of capital. And there's also a time issue. I mean, given good luck and the following winds, you can get a battery factory or an EV factory up in 1 to 2 years. You're talking 3 to 5 years to develop a raw material project. And now if you stick the qualification needs of the battery industry on the end of that, it could take 12 to 18 months for that material to get qualified to actually be used in the battery industry. So, you know, we really are struggling with a huge time limitation because we haven't acted fast enough in terms of financing these projects.
Yeah. So if I refer back to your statement that we need better planning, governments helping out, what specifically do you want them to help out with regard to planning?
I like to see governments streamlining the planning process to allow these projects to go through more easily. Certainly in the upstream part of the business, we're really struggling. We're struggling with permits for drilling, for exploration drilling. We're struggling with permits to develop processing plants, for projects, for permits to develop demonstration plants and pilot plants, it takes a very, very long time. I mean, the bulk of the projects that I'm following in Europe, they are developing at probably 30 to 50% of the rate that projects are developing overseas. And as Europe, we can't afford for that to be happening. We've got to enable those projects to go much faster.
Yeah, I understand. So, so the ongoing war actually at the Ukraine at this point, I sometimes tell it to people. It's cynical to say it, but it's a blessing in disguise for the energy transition. And you see that what, at least in Europe, take normally years, can now be fixed in 2 weeks. Is that something that you're hopeful for as well for this dossier? Or
I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but at this point, anything that speeds up government understanding of the issues associated with developing these primary materials is good for the situation. We need governments to understand how critical this situation is. I mean, just to give you an idea, I've taken my EV sales forecasts for the next 10 years down because I don't believe we can produce enough raw material to actually hit those sales forecasts. So my sales forecasts, I like them to be 20 to 30% higher than they actually are. But they can't be because we're not producing enough raw materials to sell, to manufacture or even sell that number of vehicles. That's how serious the situation is.
okay, that's pretty serious then. That means that also the global goals of reducing energy, speeding up the climate change migration plans is hampered by this lack of proactivity, maybe even.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's not helpful, but let's
Sorry.
hope that let's hope at least that well, there's at least there in Europe there are a lot of dossiers are being readdressed and reassessed and get some extra speed and even money. So hopefully this is one of them as well. So thank you so much, Matt, for this insight. I'd like to go over to James Clark, who's the VP Strategic Supply Chain of Freya Batteries.
Right.
And James has worked in the commodity markets for over 15 years as a market analyst at Glencore and Xstrata, project finance as well at Caterpillar and Thompson. So you're both, I think, knowledgeable in the mining sector as well as in the financing that it requires. So for you, James, again, the same two questions. So what should be done and how should we do it?
I probably have a bit of a different view to Matt on this.
Okay.
So I'm coming from a kind of a corporate development angle on the mining side. And I'll talk you through the value chain of the battery, and then you'll understand why I think and say what I say. Amrish probably knows what's coming. I can see him smiling. So we have from the cell, you then have the cathode or anode, right? That's your first touch point to the cell. So that's really the important bit. Like, it is useless us having graphite capacity in Europe if we can't let graphite mines unless we can make good anode. That's your bottleneck. Like, I know same thing would be true on the cathode side, right? So today, if we had lithium in Europe, we've got no way to refine that or put it into a cathode since Halmek's in Russia, but apart from a tiny amount of capacity, so it's not much use to us. And you'll see this when you look at North America, and the Canadians are doing this in a very logical way. You roll it back from the cell plant. That's how you do it, because a handful of graphite is neither rare nor useful in making a car. There's no point having that unless you can turn it into a product you can put into a cell. Now, where the skill set comes in this market is not, or partly mining, but where the real difficulty lies is commercially producing anode material. Now, I have a very differing views. I think natural resource and mining companies, by and large, do that midstream step badly because it's not their skill set. It's not no reflection on the mining companies or the midstream, but miners are very, very specialized. So mining is capital intensive, it's labor intensive, and it's a skill set which for the last 10 years, people have been leading the industry because commodity prices were down. So you have certain sense of excellence in this. Western Australia would be one. There'd be a few others, but their sense of excellence in mining, concentrate processing. They're not sense of excellence in complex chemical processing. That's largely centered around Asia. And this is a skill set we do not have in the West, by and large. So people know how to do it. It'd be like giving, actually a recent example from my side. So giving me instructions how to drill a hole into a wall. Like I can drill a hole into a wall, like to put up a picture or something, but most what I'm going to end up with is a pile of concrete on the floor and cuts on my fingers and asking someone else to come do it for me. So that's the issue we have. It's that midstream. It's why particularly when you're looking at Nico's business and the likes of Urbix and the other companies in the US, like some Novonix, right? Coming in and really focusing, laser focusing on that anode. Because graphite raw materials, they're not particularly rare or difficult to get hold of. And I disagree with Matt on this, that I don't think that industry needs a huge amount of investment in that, because graphite, you are right saying you need specific types of graphite to make it. But if we're looking at synthetic, for example, the ultimate raw material for that is road tar, essentially. You need a needle coker to make it something useful, but without the needle coker, it's road tar. So I don't see there's a shortage of that raw material. There's a shortage of needle cokers. There's no shortage of the raw material. You look at the same on natural graphite. So I think we can see this playing out in, not going to name any names, but if anyone who watches the graphite market, exactly what happens is a new deposit comes on, the market crashes. Or a new deposit comes on, the product's not qualified, so you're selling it at 2/3 the market price. So that will happen too. And I think when the mining industry, it's more a question of quality over quantity on this. So you do have very good deposits, and you have good deposits in the West which have operated for a long time. And if you speak to those carbon companies, they know exactly which deposit has exactly which property to make which natural graphite. And this is very good in China. I'm guessing it's something Urbix have touched on as well when they're looking through. When you're selecting, some could be worth twice as much, some could be worth half as much, depending on that physical form of graphite. And exactly what that is a very tightly held skill set. There's not that many people who know how to do this. You do have very good carbon companies outside of China with people with this expertise. There's just not many of them. And it's something we're learning. So knowing that, I also think when we say we need investment in mining, like I've worked in corporate development in mining, I don't think more investment is really the answer there. Like what I would love, having reviewed hundreds of mining projects, is for the quality of that project work to improve, because I think that's the way you get investors in. So most mining corp dev people, if you read NI 43-101, you almost want to ask the guy, like, tell me a reason this isn't terrible. Right, that's the question. I can see Jeff giggling as well. Like, certain phrases used in the mining industry I won't repeat here, but you're looking through that and you just think, God damn it, like red flag, red flag, red flag. Really simple, basic stuff, like your cost per ton material moved. And it makes it uninvestable for institutions. It's why Matt makes the point, no institutional money comes in. It's because you can't give money to those projects if that's the understanding and the numbers they're putting in. Like they either don't understand it or they're not being honest with you. They give you two choices, right? And this is not all mining projects, but you'll notice particularly with quite a lot of the new industries, this is worse. Right, and you would have, yeah, it's more a question of that quality. And I think that'll improve over time. But I think calls for loaning, giving companies money because they're geographically located is the wrong thing to do, because you're not incentivizing the best projects. Like, I'm not saying Matt's saying that, but like EU funding towards this. I think it's more a case of the best projects will go regardless, because you do have institutional money set for this. There's private equity funds looking at it. There's auto producers looking at it. But it's difficult to make progress because you're trying to find quality assets. And in an industry where you really don't have a huge depth of management capability anymore because the prices are so up and down. So I think it's possible. Like, I think the supply is definitely there. Just what I'd like to see is it's that midstream which is important to us. Like, for both getting the product in the first place, but getting the liquidity in the market as well. So if you look at Europe, what we don't have is liquidity. So in China, if I have a fault with my anode supply from there, I can go to 4 or 5 other suppliers locally, and there's no interruption. Whereas in Europe and the US, we don't have that. So that's, for me, what I would like to see built out.
Okay, let me try to summarize and come up with another question. So you say there's a lot of these processes that might look for money show still a lot of red flags, as you said.
It's not that they're bad. It's the industry's incentivized to only fund the tier 1 on the cost curve, right? So you see these reports come out, it's, okay, we're tier 1 on the cost curve. Like 90% of the time they're not. I mean, I can think of 2 assets in the last 20 years that would have genuinely been in that position. And it just, it's not, it makes it uninvestable, it just raises big question marks. So you'd rather them just come in and be honest, confront the facts, and design around it rather than going too low.
Okay. So you you say that the midstream is lacks knowledge about the chemical processes a bit.
Yeah, and that's the important bit. So if you take the US, right, Mountain Pass with the rare earths, like until recently, I mean, this is changing now, but the US had those rare earths. They couldn't process them in the US. You had the US government investing all this money in Mountain Pass, and it would go to China to be turned into rare earths to come back. Well, I just don't think that's solving the problem. It's not that there's anything wrong with doing business with China. I mean, I think everyone here today, we're speaking to each other with Chinese-made computers, phones, software, everything else, right? Because this is Zoom, I think. So there's nothing wrong with that. We use it in our daily lives. It's more a case of your supply chain's that much longer. There's that much more working capital, as we've seen recently with the logistics. There's that much more risk put into that supply chain because of it. So it's like if you had a pet, I know, perhaps a bad example using a pet cow, but like something, you need something to turn it into something you can do something with, right? Sorry, Nico's got me. Not very vegetarian friendly, but yeah, that's basically what I'm saying. You need something to convert your raw material into something you can use. Otherwise, what's the point in having the raw material, right? And you need someone to take that raw material out that knows what they're doing. So you get the same raw material in, week out across the year. Because if I don't have that, that's going to cause me serious issues in my production process. If the grades are flicking up and down, if shipments are late, if you go bankrupt after 6 months, you didn't raise enough capital, or whatever it is.
Would there be a role for policymakers in Europe, for example, to help strengthen this midsection of the supply chain in one way or the other?
Yeah, I think so, because I think if you look at the fundamental skill set you have, like certainly take a country like Finland, like it's well known for processing of minerals, right? Like what Finland does, it's not really a mining jurisdiction as such. There's small mines there, but it processes other company stuff. Same as Germany, France has a big history of it, Netherlands as well, Norway on the ore refining. The fundamental skill sets are there, but it's the funding and the time to transition that over to the battery side. And I think that's where the EU can help. Like I wouldn't say supporting, I don't know, like I think let economics dictate which particular asset is better or not. But if you have local companies which are employed in Europe to invest in that research, I think that's probably the right way to go about it. Because it's like, take it like an individual, right? It's a transitional learning a new skill set to evolve to a developing world. As I've seen, a lot of friends actually went into the oil and gas industry, have done a similar thing and transitioned down to energy metals or another sector. So I think that's really the role governments have to help. And yeah, that's where I'd focus.
Thanks for the provoking observations. I think, James, that's specifically why you were asked to also,
and also to everyone, like, if you see a supply demand curve with a big gap like that, like really question it. Because if you're saying that's where the supply is, demand's going to get destroyed. And if you want an analogy to it, think of, I guess, all when we were kids, right? I remember in the 80s, it was always 20 years of oil left or 30 years of oil left. It's not how much is there, it's how much has been found, which is a function of how many dollars you've got to throw down drill holes.
Yes.
So it's not going to run
That's
out,
clear.
but it's having enough skilled people to take it out. That's the big thing.
Scarcity is an economic phenomena. Huh? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you, James. I'd like to go over to Jeff Townsend. Jeff is the CEO of Critical Minerals Association. Has experienced public affairs and campaigning as a strategist, working at the highest levels in business and politics. And I a couple of times already heard Jeff, Matt, and also James claiming that government should pick up the pace, help out on permits, coordinate a bit further. So I'm really curious what your what take on this. And again, for you, the same two questions: what should we do, and how should we do it? Please, yours.
Well, thank you ever so much, and thank you to the HCSS for this, and to Urbix for this conversation. And listening to both Matt and James, I find myself now questioning everything I've written down that I want to say. So I think if we take a step back and we focus on the high level, what we find is a difference between well, let's start at COP26 of all places, which, I mean, depends on which way you look at it, but I don't think did a particularly good job. But at COP26, it was said we're digging ourselves into an early grave. The reality is that we need to dig ourselves out of an early grave. That's as simple as it gets. We need more raw materials to feed the processes to build the electric vehicles, the renewable energy, etc. The arc furnaces that is going to try and meet these targets that we've got. Now, the targets that we've been set, net zero by 2050, in the UK, all electric vehicles sold by 2030, all vehicles got to be electric. To quadruple the UK's renewable energy or wind turbines by 2030, which is almost impossible to do. These are government objectives trying to meet a net zero agenda that's been set and is accepted by society. So, and actually, I don't think any of these are really moving quick enough to actually meet the the challenge, the climate challenge that we face. So what we find is a very large disconnect between finance and industry's objectives and the strategic objectives of the government. Now, there is some overlay, of course, but I think it would be fair to say that finance would be predominantly looking at return on investment. And James is giggling, so I don't know what I've said, but and I think, you know, you look at the UK, it hasn't got a critical mineral strategy yet. It's trying to develop one. It says it will have one this year. That's probably 2 years too late. 2 years ago, they were saying we're going to buy everything from the international market. I don't think that's correct. And so you have a big disconnect between where government sits in its agenda and what is feasibly possible and making industry attractive. I agree with Matt, actually. I think we do need to put finance into the upstream. Why? I think the timescale is the big issue. So if we look at the time it takes to build a gigafactory, 3 years, you've got government strategies coming online and objectives being hit by 2030, so 7 years. And we've got a whole bunch of exploration, not the majors, not even the FTSE 100 or the blue chip companies, but predominantly the actors in the critical mineral space are generally small exploration firms, and they're anywhere between 10 and 15 years away from becoming online. And why is it 10 to 15 years? Mostly because they can't get funding. As James said, they can't get funding because 90% of them don't look attractive. And so government has a really important role. Excuse me. Bit of COVID, so sorry. Government has a role of de-risking these projects. So it's not government's job, and it never will be government's job, nor should it be government's job to pick a winner. But equally, there has to be a way that you can speed up bringing an exploration firm to operation. And if you find that there's about a 5-year lag around attracting finance, how does a government de-risk that finance? That's got to be a part of the way we look at this. James is absolutely right. The midstream is key. Without securing the midstream, everything's got to go through China. China, brilliant. There's a 50-year strategy being developed and delivered. And it's done exceptionally well, and it has now monopolized the market of that midstream. It's got most of the technology, but most of that technology is powered by coal and oil and gas. Its technology and its systems are 20 years dated, which means they're not as efficient as modern technology could be. And if you look at where the automotive sector is going, and you look at where society is pushing for these ESG credentials and to meet downstream, meet net zero ambitions. It's fallacy to say that you could meet those going through that system, especially when you have to ship everything around the world through China and back. So there has to be a shift, even if you're just to do it on ESG credentials alone. There has to be a shift to building an alternative market that is ESG compliant. You add on to that China is not trying to dominate just the midstream, but China is dominating also the downstream as well. I think it's something like 70% of anodes and cathodes are built in China, which is exactly what James said. That's where the talent is, and something like 50% of the world's electric vehicles are built in China as well. So there is a absolute dominance, not only of the midstream, but of the downstream as well. And you've got Western nations saying, oh, we're going to do this. We're going to build electric vehicles. The UK has 800,000 people employed in the automotive sector. And suddenly they've realized that government strategy to meet net zero agendas is going to put a lot of those people out of a job unless they can start building gigafactories in the UK and we can build electric vehicles here. So it becomes a big mismatch. And for me, that's the big thing that I don't think anyone's touched on. The other one is the ESG credentials. I simply don't think that as it currently stands, you could say we are churning out electric vehicles that are net zero. I think VW did an advert in the UK saying the world's first net zero car, and it was pulled after two months when someone suddenly went, hang on, it's not net zero, is it? So I think that, and I think the final thing I would say is there is we're getting into a situation now where society has such a power through our mobile phones. I can take a phone, I can take a video, I can take a picture, I can stick it on Twitter. Suddenly you've changed the landscape. And I think society needs to be better, made more aware of the entirety of the supply chain. What goes into a mobile phone? What goes into an electric vehicle? Because only by changing that will governments be more proactive and more supportive of what actually needs to be done, that dirty side of the supply chain, if you will, the upstream and the midstream, compared to throwing 100 million into a gigafactory here or 200 million into a gigafactory there. The reality is there are 200 gigafactories being built in the world at the moment. 148, 150 of those are in China. China controls, that's 75%, let's say, just for ease of maths. Controls 80%, anywhere between 60 and 80% of the raw materials and the midstream, through that midstream. If you want to build a gigafactory in the UK, you're going to need an alternative to China because the supply and the demand are getting closer. And of course, they're going to feed their home market first. Why wouldn't you? You wouldn't have built one for 50 years to do it. So I think all of that needs to be taken into account. How do we do that? Look, we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be honest and say, why are we doing this? Are we doing it because we want to meet and challenge that climate threat that we face? Do we want to do it because we think this is brilliant money to be made? Or are we doing it because society is starting to think, well, we can do things differently. There's new technology available. A little bit of all of that, but until there's a coming together between the ROI of investors and meeting government as societal kind of objectives, we're still going to have some kind of disconnect that government's going to need to fix. So it's a little bit of a whirlwind. I'll hand over.
Thank you, Jeff. And you sketch again a not too fresh and positive short-term future, at least in terms of yeah, well, the speed as well as the problem with finance. My feeling is we have those discussions at our center as well. So we see a lot of governments nowadays have formulated ambitions on all kind of topics, but they forget the roadmap to get there to some extent. Is that something that you also see, or is it different?
Absolutely. And again, governments don't. So I was speaking to the Ministry of Defense a year ago, and they told me that they go down 3 levels within the supply chain. And after that, someone else's issue. Of course, it's not someone else's issue. Critical minerals, 2010, rare earths, 2019, nickel prices. There is an increasing diplomatic weighting and strategic play around critical minerals. And that's only going to get worse as supply and demand stretch from each other. So I hear people talking about, you know, the end of just in time and moving to a just in case market. And I don't think that's, I think that's overly simplistic, because if you have partner nations, we're not going to solve this by ourselves. No one nation is going to be able to solve this by itself. And therefore, collaboration between partner nations has to be the way to do it. And you can still have a just-in-time supply chain in that if you can build it, but we have to build it. And that starts with that midstream, because if you don't have the midstream, you can put money into any project in the world, it's still going to go to China. And that's the biggest problem. Thank you,
Jeff. So yeah, we heard the various positions or analysis on the topic. When I would be a politician, then I still find it difficult to really pinpoint what I should do to make this work. It probably needs an industry strategy, which we're still lacking to some extent. Well, at the same time, if you look at the critical raw materials list of the EU, which was published in 2020 in September, there's 1 or 2 appendices where they even call it battery material mines, locations in Europe that have these materials that we need. At the same time, I think it was James who made a point that there are quite some EU countries that do have the skills. And it's a matter of bringing it all together and speed it up and put some finance towards it to have this midstream, more chemical oriented processes in place. And at the same time, I hear you say, Jeff, that 75 of all production facilities worldwide are now under Chinese control, and even the total value chains are there in their control. So I think the floor is now open a bit for some more discussions. I was asking myself, who should I give the floor first, but I do it the other way around. Who wants the floor first? Nico, you were first. Go ahead.
All right. There are several questions here. One of them is from Steve Riedel. We know Steven at Urbix very well. He's with Asbury Carbons. And there are several items that I wrote down here. One of his questions was, it's not just raw mineral processing bottleneck that we will be facing. It's also the talent of the individuals that know how to process the same, right? So the beauty of what we do at Urbix is that, and also some of the risk, let's just be frank, is that this is a new approach of processing graphite. So the expertise is already within Urbix. if you're a conventional anode processor that is trying to figure out how to serialize using attrition milling and coating utilizing the conventional method, well, the real experts are typically from China or Asia. And there's might be a few that look like, you know, me in a way. So it is extremely difficult to be able to pinpoint who these individuals are. So when you actually hit the godfather of anode making, utilizing the conventional method, then you already struck gold, right? But that specific talent bottleneck is real, as well as the dependency on that equipment to make anode in that conventional method. So that's another topic, perhaps, of another discussion that we need to bring forth. Another of the questions that was put here is something about it's a long question about new technologies coming in online. Guys, let's not lie to ourselves. New technologies that would replace graphite in the next 10 years won't happen. To be sufficiently available in the market to replace the capacity needed to be able to achieve the demand, period, right? So when you have all this silicon stuff, all this solid state, hamburger meat technologies coming in online the next 10, 15 years, guys, if we want to achieve the goals of this energy transition, we need to stick with what works. And what works is graphite, all right? This is also an industry that takes a significantly long amount of time to adopt new technologies, and the adoption is not overnight. It might be expedited or fuel or catalyzed in a way to reduce that time frame of 20 years to maybe 5, 10, but we need to be real to ourselves. And that's another big issue that actually a lot of the investors are being gaslighted by when figuring out what they should put money on, which is, oh, I'm not going to put money on graphite. Yes, because of all the other issues that Matt and James have mentioned, but also because it will be replaced by this technology that VW already invested $10 million in, right? You know, $10 million to VW, I don't want to speak for them, but it's probably, you know, hey, you know, the CEO traveled $10 million worth of private jets a year, right? So to them, it's frankly nothing. So there seems to be a lack of understanding. There's also on the chemistries, but also there seems to be uneducated type of institutional investor base that is looking to actually finance these type of projects to be able to determine what they're looking into. I think we have the pyramid completely inversed, the pyramid backwards. We tend to focus on the end product instead of actually the foundation that would actually support that. You know, we need to be very cognizant of the fact that there will be a gap in demand and capacity. But it might not be as wide as we think it is. But we need to be able to develop a very educated strategy as to how we will fund those, and how we will fund those. In my personal belief, or in the Urbix belief, is that through strategics, you know, coming in, supporting a specific project, giving some sort of assurance to those institutional that, hey, this specific graphite processing project will work. Because we're backing it, they've been qualified to an extent, and also governments identifying that and coming in and being a supportive foundation as well to this type of investments through the loan program office, through grants from the government, et cetera, will also create that, will get the snowball rolling, right? So that the institutionals perhaps can feel a little bit more comfortable in this. There's other specific mention that I wrote down here that I wanted to mention. I don't know, I said specialty chemicals roles of snowball effects. I think I cover all my points for now. Sorry, Matt.
Thank you, Nico. Matt?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just come back on this technology question, and it's one that comes up quite regularly in the battery materials space. And it primarily comes about because this is still quite an immature space. And, you know, a lot of people asking about new technology development, you know, where are we on solid state batteries, et cetera, and so on. And I echo what Nico said, because effectively, if you look at the 256, 257, maybe 270 gigafactories online or under construction now, how many of those are using solid state technology? Maybe 2, maybe 3 of them. You know, the huge bulk of those factories are being equipped for lithium ion technology of various forms or another. So, you know, it is a problem. You know, to some extent, it is putting off investment in various areas of raw materials, because people are turning around and saying, well, you know, can I invest for 20, 30, 40 years? Or are we just looking at an industry that's going to use this technology for 10 years and then move on? But realistically, this industry is looking at the current technology for at least 10 to 15 years or so. And, you know, the automakers are not going to move away from the current technology anytime soon. So I think, you know, investors can take some confidence in the current technology. The other point that I want to make just briefly is with regards to government investment in the value chain. And one of the areas where we've seen governments investing a lot is in the downstream side, but specifically in the recycling space. And I just want to make the point that there's no point really in investing in the recycling space now, when we need to increase supply of these raw and processed materials by probably 10 times over the next 10 to 15 years. I mean, realistically, apart from the scrap material that's available at cathode factories and battery factories, the issue that we're dealing with is that these lithium-ion batteries will have 10 to 15-year lifetimes. So we're not going to be able to derive significant amounts of supply from recycling probably until the late 2030s. So recycling is a little bit of a white elephant insofar as, yes, we obviously want to recycle. We don't want to be wasting our materials. The circular economy is very, very important. But in terms of recycling's impact on actual supply of raw materials, it's going to be irrelevant for at least 10 to 15 years. So, you know, it's very important. And I come back to James's point, you know, he picked up on the fact that I was talking about upstream. I was talking about upstream and midstream in my comments. We definitely do need investment in midstream, but we certainly also do need investment in upstream. And the final point I'll make is what is useful for the mining industry is not necessarily what's attractive to the battery and electric vehicle industry. What the battery and electric vehicle industry wants is oversupply of battery raw materials so that prices go down. What the mining industry wants is high prices. So, you know, we've got to look at what's right for both industries and arrive at a happy medium.
Thank you, Matt. Well, in 2012, the London Metal Exchange was bought by the Chinese. I think it was, well, they kept their reserves secret to balance the prices, so that the mining and exploration projects could survive. Is that an issue here as well? So how stable do you need to have the prices to get the mine stable and have this process up and running?
We need prices above the marginal cost of constructing new capacity. So, you know, just to give you some sort of information. So, for instance, in the hard rock lithium area in Western Australia, prices in the third quarter of 2020 were around $350 a ton. Prices now are between $3,500 a ton and $4,000 a ton. So do we need prices to be that high? No. But, you know, we would need prices to be higher than the incentive cost of new capacity and to remain that high across the cycle. So, yeah, I mean, that's you know, that's really what we're talking about in terms of prices, higher than they were in 2020, but not necessarily as high as they are now.
And I think oh, sorry, please, James, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Amish, you go, buddy. I'll go after you.
No, I was about to say that following Matt's remark on incentive prices, it actually dovetails back to the point that you made, James, that not every project upstream is a viable project. And even if you have the right incentive price, what is it, an incentive price, right? It basically means a price that is higher than the cash cost at which a producer can produce its product. And that cash cost element differs per project, right? So, one project can produce at $100 per ton, the other at $300 per ton. So I absolutely, as a principle, agree with Matt. But it does dovetail back to what James said. And I think in essence, we're all aligned here in the sense that it's not only about the upstream, it's also about the processing. And indeed, we need to find the right balance so that processing companies actually don't overpay for material, which they cannot or difficult can pass through in a difficult way.
I mean, I think, yeah, I agree with that. Amrit says. I mean, actually, my view is, as long as the microphone's working, the prices are going to be very, very volatile. This will be boom and bust on lithium prices going forward. So it's not going to be an upward curve. It'll be like cobalt prices. It'll get to a point, I don't know whether that's now or $100,000, and it'll snap and come off very, very quickly and then snap back up, because you're not looking at many tons to move this market. So to give you a rough idea, your lithium spodumene exports from WA, one of the biggest suppliers of spodumene to the rest of the world, it's about 2 million tons a year. Now that sounds like a lot, but it's 6,000 tons a day, right? That's, if you're looking at a gold mine, that's the amount of ore a very small gold mine or medium-sized gold mine probably would shift in a year. So it's not massive. And the second point on the costs, it's my view actually that the base costs in this market need to be a lot higher than it indicated. So I think consensus view is about $600, something for a long-term spodumene price, or it was maybe 700.
It's about 900 now. 900.
Oh, about 900. Yeah. Okay. So I would say it's not, oh, why that is. I'd say probably closer to 1,000, because you're looking at the quality of the new projects, right? So if we take what we know about the industry, so Pilbara Minerals, they're roughly a 1-to-1 strip, and they were judged by the financial statements back in 2020. They were making money at $400 or $500 a ton. So call it 400. If you're looking at a new asset and they've got a 10 or 15-to-1 strip, so what that would mean is, for those that aren't mining, it's for every 1 ton of ore, you got to move 15 tons of waste. Right, so moving a ton of ore, cost per ton material moved, and again, this is an important one if you're reading mining studies. In Australia now is about $5. Most Canada is like 3.5, 4, and most studies will say it's 2. So please use those higher numbers. When you're looking at that, that makes a very, very big difference to their cost base. So if you're reading through an I-43-101 that's assumed it's a 10-to-1 strip at $2 a ton material moved, your actual cost is double what they're telling you, right? Because we know when you're speaking to mining contractors, that costs $4. Or by and large, unless they've got a very special rate, I can't say that they don't have, I'm just saying probability basis, since this is broadcast. You see what I mean? So this will be a lot higher. So I think it's a case of, when we're looking forward, it will be volatile. Investors will see that, because it'll be scaring them off, but your base will be getting higher. So I think it's the ones that get in at the bottom of the cycle will do very, very well. And it's just a question of picking that particular management team you think will be able to do it well.
I think the other element to be aware of, which unfortunately we all have to be aware of now, is that with higher energy prices, which seem set to be the norm, the cost curve is rising. So the cost curve for all of these materials, whether it's graphite or lithium or nickel, the cost curve is rising, which means that your incentive price for these materials will rise as long as we have the energy crisis, which doesn't look set to stop anytime soon. And I think, you know, the regionality of the energy crisis is core as well, particularly in Europe, where we are very much struggling with these very high gas prices and very high power prices. And it will have a major impact on the graphite market in particular, for those companies that are relying on thermal purification of natural graphite or producing synthetic graphite. and that is going to have quite significant carryover impacts.
Absolutely, absolutely, Matt. Michelle, if I can add one thing to what Matt said there,
Please.
and it's actually quite interesting because we have mentioned it in the report. Like Nico in the beginning mentioned, you have two types of graphite that go into the battery anode. So you have natural flake and you have synthetic. What Matt is actually describing here with the energy crisis, we have already seen an episode like that in China. A couple of months ago in November, Chinese leadership was so worried about the supply of energy that they actually decreed companies that are in an energy intensive business, just like anode makers, to curtail their energy sourcing. And what that means is that in a market that is already tight for battery materials, if you curtail or if you decree anode producers to curtail their energy supply or sourcing, you basically make that market even tighter. And that triggered or accelerated the interest of synthetic graphite sourcers, people who use synthetic graphite, to look at alternatives such as natural flake graphite production. And that is, I think, where companies like Urbix come into play. When you have a solution to produce anode material, but in ways that are less energy intensive and that are cleaner, you have a really powerful tool set at your disposal, because you're less dependent on energy.
Can I mention something that you just hit, Amrish, is the energy component, which actually, if you're going to be a processor, try to be a pure play processor, because the moment that you actually try to go downstream, or I tend to get those wrong, downstream, and you want to be a mine, let's just say in northern Mozambique, with already a geographical location that is propense to geopolitical risk, you immediately tend to shoot yourself in the foot because you're already exposed to those potential instabilities. Can you guys hear me or no?
Yeah.
Okay, one of them went kaput on me. So with that said, let's just look at the European Union as a bloc. I believe the European Union has Norway already up and running, Ukraine in terms of graphite, and Russia, two of which, it's a coin toss at the moment. Well, it's no longer a coin toss, it's just not accessible. So you have Norway, and then you have a couple of Swedish junior mining projects that are coming in online. When you talk to the OEMs, they tell you, oh, this is a three-legged stool. We want to onshore processing capacity. We want to make it traceable in the sense that we know where it's coming, and also reduce the CO2 carbon footprint. And then the third one is we want it at a competitive price. So every single leg of that stool, it's an oxymoron to each other, right? Think about it, oh, we want to pay it at $4 a kilo, but we want it to be environmentally friendly, and we want people not to be, 18 or younger when processing this thing. So if you're the European Union, you're thinking, where do I grab my graphite from? Well, I'm thinking Madagascar, Mozambique. Keep in mind that ships don't run on nuclear ships, or they don't run on electricity, right? So they do emit a lot of carbon. So immediately you're already, cutting one of those legs out of the stool. So what are the goals of the OEMs? What are you trying to achieve, and what is the order of? So, don't be hypocritical about the message you're communicating, saying, oh, we're here to, hug trees and save the world, and we're going to make environmentally friendly cars. No, dude, you get one or the other, period. With the understanding that you will have to emit CO2 to be able to achieve some of these goals. So that leads me straight to another point that I wanted to bring up, is that analysts, the world, the governments fail to understand that there's significant amounts of private mines already up and running that would give you the capacity or enable you with the raw material that you would need to an extent in the next 2 to 3 years, right? Because again, a lot of these junior mining projects like Urbix, we're still an early stage company, we are subjected to the ability of our fundraising. So if we are able to tap onto these private mining sources, we might get a better deal because they can actually enable capacity in a significantly faster manner and also at a cheaper capital cost. That's a fact. So when we are actually addressing how robust is this industry or the capabilities of this industry, we best take those private sources of product into consideration.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Where the higher prices mean that projects that wouldn't have been looked at 3-4 years ago are now coming online and potentially there to deliver supply. And so you find this weird position where we need to massively increase supply into the markets if we're going to meet these targets that are there. Equally, the prices are unsustainable and the projects aren't necessarily going to attract the investors. And, you know, not many people in the world can afford a $50,000 Tesla. And if the price is going up, and 80% of the price is the battery, the prices can't continue to go up because there just simply won't be the demand. It's a wonderful oxymoron in this industry, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Jeff, unfortunately, a lot of policymakers in the West just do not understand or fail to see the complete picture, right? In one of the previous reports about critical minerals, you know, I also wrote about the necessity to build bridges between producing countries and consuming countries, and not looking at it in a way that is one-dimensional, but really take the producing countries in that process so that they get the feeling that they're part of the value chain, right? And it's one of the recommendations that we took into this report. You have to build coalitions, otherwise you will not survive, right? You will not get the access to the raw materials that you require.
Yeah, and we just held 2 bilaterals for the UK government, one with the Australians and one with the Canadians. And of course, the UK is looking at both those markets, saying, brilliant, partner nations pretty much aligned on policy and agendas, etc. Of course, Australia is always going to look north to Japan and South Korea because it's closer, and Canada is always going to look south. So we find ourselves as a secondary market for both, as the EU does as well. It's an interesting one, but certainly it needs to be dealt with across the supply chain and across multiple partner nations who are at least geopolitically aligned to get around that issue.
I think like a good way to probably do that, and going back, Jeff, to what we're talking about in the processing is within Europe, is we do have a chance to start with a blank slate in Europe, building this processing industry out, right? We can take the learnings from the Chinese firms, bring them in as our partners. And it's the free markets will ultimately dictate this, because there's only so long governments will play nicely with each other for whatever reason. You get a change in administration, they fall out, something changes, right? But usually it's the same with any legal contract. As long as there's a dollar incentive for both sides to perform, they will perform. As soon as that dollar incentive is gone, they won't, right? And that's the way I would see it, is that when Europe wants to do this, building that midstream and giving the cell producers liquidity in that market, it also means not only you're creating value for the battery producer and car producer and creating jobs there, but you're also creating, I can't say fairer, but you're creating an alternative source of sale for graphite miners and other battery raw material producers across the world. So you don't have to just sell into China, you can sell into Europe, Japan, or anywhere else. And I think that is probably the more powerful thing you can do, because it adds value on all sides. And also, when you're looking at raw material producer, if you've got a processing unit for graphite in the middle, you can source from 5 or 10 different mines. Like for me speaking as a battery producer, if I'm sourcing from refining something like Urbix, effectively I'm diversifying my supply chain so much by doing that, because it's not one vertically integrated producer that could have an issue. So then we've seen it even with some of the largest mining companies in the world. A vessel sinks in the harbor or a train derails and they're out for 2 weeks. Whereas if you've got that depth of supply, it makes it a lot better. And that's what China's done, right? You look at where the money's being banked in China in the battery industry, it's in the conversion capacity. Like it's Gangfang, Shanxi, the battery producer getting bigger and bigger on thin margins, so the ultimate numbers larger. But a lot of those initial profits, initial fortunes were made in that midstream because it gives you the opportunity to trade around the assets and optimize. It's my thoughts. I think that's where Europe could really win on this.
Let me raise a question that's more geopolitical, maybe. Now that China still is a dominant player in this market, to what extent, in your view, are they capable of controlling that position? They did it and do it still, I think, with rare earth, make it almost impossible to come up with big alternatives besides those under their control. So who can I give the floor? Matthew, you already showed your hand, and James as well. So Matthew, you're first.
Yeah, I would say it's going to be less easy for them to do it with battery materials than with rare earths, because in rare earths, they're controlling 70% of the primary supply of rare earths, as well as having all the processing capacity. In battery materials, yes, they're controlling the majority of the processing capacity, but they're importing the bulk of the raw materials, apart from in graphite, where they have their own domestic supply. So I think, in the broader battery material space, it'd be more difficult for them to control supply and use that as a geopolitical influence. In the graphite space in particular, they will be more able to do that if they wanted to. And in fact, we already saw at the back end of last year when they announced the supply shutdowns because of the power situation, it already had a big impact on the graphite market, both in graphite concentrate prices and in spherical graphite and synthetic graphite prices. So I think, in the graphite market, it's certainly more of a concern than it is in the rest of the battery materials markets, where they're very much dependent on imports. But again, that highlights again why it's so important to set up local supply chains for all of the battery materials, but certainly graphite in particular.
Okay, James?
I kind of echo what Matt says in certain regards. I would say not to think of China as, I guess it sometimes does with the government, the way it moves, but it's not North Korea, right? China's a free market economy by and large. The government can restrict power here and there, but so you do that in the West as well, right? You look at the Canada rail strikes, everything else, it's nothing unusual. So the reason China has done so well on the industry side is they've produced a product which is equally as good or better at a price which is equal or lower than anything we could do than anything someone outside of China could do better, right? And you look at the reasons why. It's outsourcing to China in the 70s and 80s, as was pointed out by Nico. It's a rigorous process approach that Chinese companies take to do this. It's streamlined permitting and everything else. So I think honestly, the answer is you either pay, I think it was going back to Jeff Ramrish, you either pay more temporarily to set this up in the West as companies with dollars, or the governments fund it, or you develop something which works better as part of the free market. There are considerations within that, right? And when you're looking at an actual dollar offset to importing from Asia, you count in, it's 6 weeks, on a good 6 weeks to ship the material. So you've got to finance that working capital. You've got to take on the vessel. You've also got to take the risk. You need more safety stock, because if you have an issue with that vessel, and we saw with the Suez getting blocked and various other issues, this can happen, and you can't, you can fly things, but it's going to get very expensive. So you need to have that buffer in place. There's additional costs to importing from that far away. But I think probably if you look at the rest of the industry, the lesson it's taught us, the auto industry and everything else, is people will go where things are cheapest. I would imagine most of your auto components in Europe, right, they're assembled in Europe. I bet money they're mostly Chinese bits that are put together in Europe. What we're talking about, the laptops we're wearing, right? I would guess the majority of clothes sold in Europe aren't made in Europe, because if they were made in Europe, they'd be 10 times the price. And people just don't buy them. There's the option there, but they just don't buy them. And the battery market, in my view, is going to be no different.
No, but I think you touched on a really good point there, James. People and companies tend to go and produce in places where it's economically more feasible to do so, or where they're more incentivized to do so. But actually, a couple of months ago, Michel and I had a chat. I think Michel interviewed me for that, and it's on YouTube, where I basically said, today there is nobody in the Netherlands or in France or in the UK or in the US that would say that it's a bad thing to subsidize farmers, right? Why? Because we all have a common understanding that if we don't do that, most likely we will end up being very dependent on outside countries for our food supply, like more than we are already today, right? So there is an incentive to subsidize and support, let's say, certain economic activities that are not per se viable, but are strategically important. And agriculture is one such example. And I think as part of the public debate, we should add into that mix critical minerals and battery materials. To what extent do we find it important to reduce our dependency, and at what cost, right? And I think all of us here would find it a very nice idea to put a bunch of policymakers, politicians, ministers, and bureaucrats into maybe a nice room or a nice offsite location, and actually let them build their own EV, and let them build their own iPhone to see what it takes to actually manufacture these goods in situ.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more a case of, like, if you had the fresh start, right, which we do have now, and the agricultural policy, I guess it's something slightly different, but that's the thing, you can make it very efficient to start with. But sorry, anyway, yeah, I agree, Amrish. Like, it's something, if you want it domestically, you probably do have to subsidize, at least to start with. But you can subsidize on the tech rather than subsidize the operating.
So I think,
Jeff, you wanted to chip in, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really looking at the downstream industry that you're looking at. So with automotives, with electric, with your mobile phones, is controlling where that comes from of importance. Who knows? But when you look at semiconductors and things, or the rare earths going into F-35s, then suddenly you find governments a bit more twitchy about the supply chains nowadays, considering that these supply chains have become increasingly more diplomatic. And then you really look at two questions, don't you? It's are we concerned that China controls supply chains, or that China dominates supply chains? The reality is China will always dominate the critical mineral supply chain. But there will need to be an alternative supply chain to stop it from controlling and having that diplomatic power, should it want to exercise it at any point. Where is that? Where is that difference? James said it. China produces as good quality at the prices that we just can't compete with. So you look at how they do that in the rare earths. It's about 25% rare earths are passed along the supply chain until they hit the final stages of the midstream off. So subsidized basically by the state, which means that you can't compete with that if you were to build a rare earth system outside, unless you're building the entirety of the supply chain. So the alternative is, and it comes back to what I think Jeff Amrish said, is traceability. So you look at the likes of VW, Tesla, Polestar, Boeing, they're all starting to employ blockchain tracking, other systems of traceability of ESG and carbon, and source certain out there who can do chemical analysis of where the mineral has come from, etc. That's brilliant, but it also means that those downstream companies that are more in the spotlight of society have to live up to those ESG compliance. And so naturally they will have to create an alternative to the one that exists. Why do you want to do that though? It's whether you want to stop dominance or control. And that's really the question you're getting to.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so there are various opinions on the strengths of the EU. but one I think is more and more seen as quite dominant, that they are a force for, say, norms and standards. And that means that if you use your ESG as a put them on a really high standard, it's very difficult for some producers in the world to get to the EU market. So I think that's one incentive. The other one is the strategic autonomy, as I think Amrish also suggested, that I think the EU is willing to spend some more money on these issues to start well, enhancing its strategic autonomy at least a bit. You see it now with energy, you'll see it in other places as well. So in order to prevent, as Jeff already said, to be using your positions for geopolitical purposes, so power projection basically, I think there's some way to go still, but I think the EU is quickly getting mature now, that this should be the case, and that they probably are willing to also help spending time and effort, and probably also coordinate further. So that last week we saw a new phenomena that the EU countries altogether agreed that the EU Commission should start buying gas first time, and that's over in 4 weeks' time. It normally would take 2, 4, 5 years maybe to discuss this. It's now within 4 weeks, it's done. So I foresee this kind of mechanism to show up more often. So in that sense, I'm an optimist to some extent. I do believe in free market, although the free market does not exist. It doesn't exist in China, it doesn't exist in the West. So I think there's a lot to say for industry policies here to make this happen, and to have a bit of what's being said now and then to the Western world actually, and to manipulate markets, which everybody does, towards our goals and ambitions a bit more maybe. I'm looking a bit at the clock. We still have a couple of minutes. What I would like to try is to at least come up with a couple of takeaways. So, and then maybe Amrish, you could fill in a bit more if I might miss one or two. On the one hand, it's being said by Matt and others, we need better planning, streamlining the planning in terms of permits for drilling, processing, pilot plans. And that's one point. On the other one, there's competition is not the issue. We need all the stuff. And I think that's another point made, which is important. I think, and that's a nice forecast also for Nico, for Urwix. The other one is, and we did not touch upon it, at least not in the way I questioned it, is there's quite a lot of markets, and there's quite a lot of money in the market. But the issue is that it hampers at midstream. So hopefully it's possible also for policymakers in the EU and in America and others to help a bit there, to have that boosted. The other thing is that, and that's the point, I think, Jeff, you made that point, stating we have to be honest. Is it about climate threats? Is it money, or is it new tech? From my point of view, it should be climate, because that's existential. That's not a matter of a business case. The return on investment on climate threat mitigation is not there. We should do it anyway. So hopefully that helps a bit to get that across. And then the question is, okay, if that's the ultimate goal, is there enough money, and is a new tech coming on board soon enough? But that's my position actually. And there's another point I think made by some of you, that's the lack of understanding of how finance should be done on the chemistry side, that we need to build a whole pyramid as well as that we have to take care of the risk that is involved and how that could be mitigated and helped by governments to maybe also help mitigating that point. So maybe the last point, and that I think that's your profession, Jeff, is we have to campaign to make this happen and make it clear to all those involved in making this transition, actually. So maybe Ambrish, I'll give you the floor because I might have missed 1 or 2 points.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it well, Michel. I think basically, if I can add 2 points, but which basically wrap up what you just said as well, and which you can find back in the report. You know, and this is dovetailing back to what both James and Matt said. We're not looking to secure the right quality. We're not looking to secure the right quantity. We're looking to secure the right quality in the right quantity, because this is the biggest challenge that regions like the EU and North America are facing at the moment. If we want to build up our own supply chain, we really need quantity. We need the right volumes in the right quality. And as Matt pointed out quite well, it takes time to qualify product, right? So, and it takes time equally to develop a mine. So how do you then secure the right quantities with the right qualities is the question. Basically, what we said in the report is two ways. First of all, there should be an environment in the West where graphite processing companies like Urbix, but there are others as well, are encouraged to scale up their operations and provide responsibly produced and high quality product to the end users, i.e. battery factories. Now that's one. The second thing that you need to do, and we touched upon this point as well, you need to create a system where the EU and North America get more direct access to secure their supply. And you cannot do this by yourself. You need to do this in a coalition. Just as a reference, 2 weeks ago, China had its annual 2 sessions, which is a very important political event, which takes place every year. And during these 2 sessions, it reiterated its commitment to go full speed ahead with renewable energy. So that means you will get a new great game. You will get a fight over critical raw materials. Hopefully not material in a military sense, but absolutely you will see more movement in mergers and acquisitions and companies securing that raw material. Now, on this specific last topic, I think there is an obligation or a task for people like ourselves to educate policymakers on how they can actually build that coalition of the willing, if you want to say it like that. And the report basically gives a couple of tools. Let me just share 3 of them. First of all, we need to incentivize producers and developing markets. So a country like Mozambique, Madagascar, you know, that produces graphite, we should think about actively how we can engage those countries further in the supply chain, offering them not only a place as a producer, but also down the road where the real value is created. So that's one suggestion. Then the other suggestion is that we try to find ways where we can bring upstream and downstream together. And it dovetails back into the point that both James and Matt made. We need to involve the OEMs and the battery makers earlier in the process, for instance, midstream, but also potentially upstream, right? And then the third and last point is, let's have a look how we can actually create coalitions that allow free trade to occur between producing countries and consuming countries. Today in Europe, I think Europe is a very good example of a free trade zone, a free trade area. But for outsiders, Europe can still be Fort Europe. And we should think about how to ease those barriers to entry, especially if it concerns product from countries that we want to befriend and want to consider our allies.
Thank you, Jeff. So, well, let me end then here with saying thank you to all of the panelists, and especially I think also to Nico, sorry, making it possible for us to do the report, to have this nice conversation that helped deepen up a bit more of the do's and don'ts and what we should do anyways, as also Ambrish suggested. So I hope this was received well. What we will do, we will make this a nice video, maybe shorten it here and there a little bit, but we'll promote it, and hopefully we get to the audiences that we'd like to be informed more than they might already be. So I'd like to thank you all very much for your time and the efforts in making it. And Nico, if you want, as one of the sponsors of this event, you can have the floor for the last famous words if you want to.
No,
if not,
I won't steal Ambrish's closing statement. So thanks everybody for joining, and James, Matt, and Jeff, thank you so much, Ambrish and Michelle and all the people at HCSS. Thank you guys.
Okay, thank you so much, and hope to see you around. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye bye.